welcome to the fifth session of Update 2021. Welcome, Dr. Chitwan Dubey.
Good evening, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah,
Really
I
honored.
met Dr. Chitwan when she was at Seven Hills. Now she is at LH Hiranandani. So when I was planning the update program, I thought the family physicians must know about the developments in antenatal care, especially of BOH patients, and the assisted reproduction, because the abbreviation IVF, ICSI, GIF, all that is very confusing. So I requested Dr. Chitwan, and here we are today. So without wasting much time, I hand it over to you, Dr. Chitwan. Please share your screen and start.
Yes, sir.
We will take all the questions towards the end.
Okay, sir. Okay, sir.
Yeah.
A very good evening to all the guests here. This is quite a complex topic which we are going to take today. So basically, we are going to talk about bad obstetric history in a very systematic way because, like, if we talk of bad obstetric history, it would mean recurrent pregnancy losses. And recurrent pregnancy losses, then when somebody gets pregnant after those and we have to take the pregnancy ahead, then there are certain things which we absolutely need to keep in mind, and we have to be like hawks guarding the patient and the baby. And at the same time, there are times where repeated pregnancy losses would overlap with the need for artificial reproductive techniques because of the genetic involvement or certain other factors involvement. So now I've taken these slides which I'm going to present now will be most of them are taken from the recommendations which are given by the American Society of Reproductive Medicine and the European Society of Human Reproduction and Embryology, so that we can overlap with the case scenarios which we generally face and move ahead and try to understand it together. So miscarriage is defined as the spontaneous loss of pregnancy before the fetus reaches viability. We just talked about it. The term would include all pregnancy losses from the time of conception until 24 weeks of gestation. So when we talk of the epidemiology of recurrent pregnancy losses, 5% of couples attempting pregnancy have 2 or more consecutive losses. 1% of these will have 3 or more consecutive losses. Most clinicians consider recurrent pregnancy losses even if the losses are not consecutive. 34% pregnancy losses in a prospective cohort of healthy women were studied, and 22% of them were unrecognized and detected by assays only. 12% were clinically recognized. And when we talked of the obstetrical history, the previous obstetrical history, if it had any prediction about it, then the prior success rate would determine almost as high as a almost 95% chance of a success. So just 4 to 6% chance of a loss. And if there was a prior loss, then there was only a 75% chance of success, roughly speaking. When we talk of the definition of RPL, classically, we would define it as 3 or more consecutive pregnancy losses. But when we talk of the expanded definition by the American School of Reproductive Medicine, 2 or more consecutive losses are now even considered as recurrent pregnancy loss. Risk of further losses, because in the second one, would be similar to 2 versus 3 consecutive losses. Initiation of evaluation is appropriate, therefore, even after 2 losses. So basically, we'll start from the definition now because I think I've grouped up slightly there. Okay, sir. So basically, classically, 3 or more consecutive pregnancy losses before 20 weeks were considered as recurrent pregnancy losses. But the American school kind of redefined it, because even if we talk about 2 losses, then the third loss is kind of inevitable if we've not really corrected the cause of the loss. Primary RPL would mean no previous full-term pregnancy. A secondary RPL would mean at least 1 successful pregnancy. Miscarriage would mean an embryonic loss before 10 weeks. A fetal loss would be after 10 weeks. So I was just talking about this, but the slide was not there. Maybe we should go through the slide because this is one of my favorite slides when I teach the DNB students. Recurrence would suggest a persistent cause, not just a bad luck. And that's why we should not say bad obstetric history. We should use the term recurrent pregnancy loss, because it is the onus is on us as doctors to find that recurrent cause and to correct it. What are the risk factors for RPL? When we talk of the epidemiology, advanced maternal age, most of the patients nowadays, most of the girls, they have their careers and things, and then they plan their pregnancies much later in life. So advanced maternal age is one of the huge contributing factors. Number of previous miscarriages also have a significant role. Like I said, after consecutive losses, the chances of getting a loss again, if the cause is not found, becomes even more excessive. The risk of miscarriage is 40% after 3 consecutive pregnancy losses, and advanced paternal age also contributes, unlike the thought process that it doesn't, it does. And obesity is also one of the factors. Cigarette smoking contributes, as well as caffeine consumption in excess would contribute. So even moderate alcohol consumption would contribute. So we have to be careful about aligning the patient and convincing her to give up on those factors when we are actually dealing with a recurrent pregnancy loss. So the causes could be either an abnormal embryo or a hostile maternal environment. So when we talk of an abnormal embryo, it could be a structural anomaly, it could be a cardiac, renal, or something which is not compatible with life. It could be a diaphragmatic hernia, or it could be some chromosomal anomaly in the embryo. Or it could be a hostile maternal environment, which could be because of uterine factors, antiphospholipid syndrome, thrombophilias, alloimmune causes, infective causes, or endocrine causes. So when we're talking of causative factors, if you look at the distribution, 40 to 50% of them will always belong to the unexplained recurrent pregnancy losses. And these would be non-antiphospholipid syndrome induced and thrombophilias. 2 to 5% are genetic factors. 10 to 15%, because genetic factors do not lead to repeated losses. We would think the first time an abortion occurs, we would usually tell the patient and not investigate also that the first trimester losses, especially in the early pregnancy, would be due to a genetic factor. But then repeated losses usually have another factors playing their role. 10 to 15% anatomical factors are there. 20% autoimmune reasons. Very rarely, although we think of TORCH so hugely, but only 0.5 to 5% infective causes are there and recurrent losses, and 70 to 20% endocrine factors. Because when we talk of infections, we have to remember that infections would be self-healing, the TORCH infections at some stage. So they wouldn't be causing recurrent losses. When we are talking recurrent, we are not thinking of those. Although spontaneous, a single loss could be due to infection, and the percentage-wise contribution would be much more. 70 to 20% endocrine factors, because till the hormonal profile is corrected, subsequent pregnancy losses would happen repeatedly. Anatomical factors, when we are talking of those, there would be Mullerian anomalies, septate, biconvate, unicornate, T-shaped uterus, submucous fibroids, endometrial polyps, intrauterine adhesions. Hysteroscopy has changed this scenario. Now, we are able to diagnose and pick up these anomalies inside the uterus and correct them and move ahead. So this is a very correctable cause of recurrent pregnancy loss. How does a uterine anomaly cause a recurrent pregnancy loss, or a fibroid or a polyp? Smaller uterine cavity, fewer sites for a suitable implantation, and aberrations of the vascularization even if the placentation happens. And this all may be accompanied with a cervical incompetence, which leads to both early and late pregnancy losses. Congenital uterine malformations, the incidence is 1.8% to as high as 37.6% in certain races, and also determined by consanguineous marriages and certain other factors. Prevalence is higher in women with second versus first trimester miscarriages, but this may be related to the cervical weakness that's frequently associated with uterine malformations. Women with arcuate uteri, which is a variation of normal, tend to miscarry more in the second trimester, while women with septate uteri are more likely to miscarry in the first trimester. In the septate uteri, which is very common and very, very correctable, it could be a complete complete septum, it could be incomplete, or it could just be a segmental. 25% of early abortions are caused due to septate uterus. 6.2% of late abortions are due to septate uterus, and sometimes premature labor happens because so many times if with the septate uterus the pregnancy can continue till 14-16 weeks, and if we can take it to 34 weeks, usually we do get a premature labor, but we are able to get a viable baby. The treatment is, of course, as I said, hysteroscopic septum resection, excision. Unicornate uterus is found in 20% of uterine anomalies. Agenesis or hyperplasia of the Mullerian duct, as we know, is the cause. It may have a rudimentary horn. Now, even if there's a rudimentary horn present, and if it's communicating or non-communicating, so many times we have to remove that rudimentary horn just so that we can get a more successful pregnancy. Otherwise, the contaminations from that side in every cycle, during the cycle time, could also cause recurrent pregnancy losses. Abortion rate is 51% in unicornate uteruses. Premature labors, malpresentations, IUGR, uterine rupture, ectopic pregnancies are very commonly seen. Cervical encirclage has a huge role to improve the pregnancy outcome in unicornate uteruses especially. Rudimentary horn, as I said, is resected to prevent dysmenorrhea, hematometra, ectopic pregnancy. And once the pregnancy happens, sometimes during the pregnancy, it needs to be resected laparoscopically if there's problem. Like usually the patient presents with excessive pain, and then we find collection of hematocolpos kind of collection there. Bicornuate uterus, 10% of anomalies. Incomplete fusion of the uterine horns, we know, at the level of the fundus. Two separate but communicating cavities are there. Abortion rate is high, 32%. Preterm labor is 21%. Metroplasty could be done in these cases if required, but usually we do not do it, and so many times we are able to get a successful outcome. There are times now in modern laparoscopy where we usually try to connect the two uteri if we can and give a wider cavity. This usually happens because of failure of lateral fusion. Abortion rate is 43%, preterm births 38% again. So all these anatomical causes make us realize that if we can prevent the abortion and take the pregnancy ahead, then we have to be prepared for a preterm birth with a good NICU facility. Resection of the vaginal septum if there's difficulty in intercourse is done, and vaginal delivery can be done in such cases, but usually we plan for cesarean sections. When we talk of an arcuate uterus, there's just this dip in the fundus which we are talking about. Because near complete resorption of UV septum, mild concave indentation is there. It is, most of the gynecologists you'll see will call it an anatomical variant, and we do not prefer touching it. At times, and even there are conflicting evidence, there's conflicting evidence of whether it does contribute to abortion. Some studies would say just 13% chance more, and some say as high as 45%. So usually people go for expectant treatment, but there would be times when we would rather just widen the cavity by a bit of fundal metroplasty in an arcuate uterus. When we talk of a T-shaped uterus, that's a tough one. 69% female fetuses suffered uterine anomaly who were exposed to DS, not so common in the current generation of young people which we are dealing with. Not
Dr.
due to
Chitwan,
DS.
little louder still.
So not due to DS, but yes, we do come across T-shaped uteri. So it is a small uterus with constriction rings. It has cervical hypoplasia, cervical incompetence, anterior cervical collar, and sometimes pseudo polyps. There's a twofold rise in abortion rates and ninefold rise in ectopic pregnancies. So in this, we would rather go for a lateral metroplasty to increase the cavity. The aim in every case here is to increase the cavity. Fibroids are commonly associated. Now, so many times there'll be a dilemma as to remove the fibroid or not to remove the fibroid when we are planning for a pregnancy. 20 to 50% of reproductive women do have fibroids. When will you consider that the fibroid is responsible for the recurrent pregnancy loss? Most important factor is the location and not the size of the fibroid. So when we talk of subserosal fibroids, the big fibroids which are outside the uterine cavity on the outer wall, and they are not distorting the endometrial cavity in any way, then we would rather not blame the subserosal fibroids for the recurrent pregnancy loss. But if the fibroid is indenting inside the uterine cavity, say it's a large submucosal fibroid, which is distorting the cavity or occupying a large subendometrial area, Then mechanical constriction or inadequate placentation will happen, which will be resulting in a poorly vascularized lining of the placentation and subsequent losses. So preconceptual myomectomy is obviously proposed in all such cases to improve the reproductive outcome. And we can decide on individual basis, because usually what we do is we do the Dopplers of the fibroids then, and we see and we do a 3D scan of the endometrial cavity just to see the lining. If it's together, if the vasculature and the Doppler flow is getting affected by the fibroids, then we want to take a call for removal of those fibroids. It's likely to have a place only in women who have recurrent pregnancy losses, the removal, and large submucosal fibroids and no other identifiable. Usually intramural fibroids will not cause losses, but if a person has intramural fibroids and they are causing the losses, intramural are the ones which are inside the myometrium and just barely touching the endometrial lining, then only if the patient has had recurrent pregnancy losses, we would want to remove this before trying to make her conceive, because that can also play a role and cause distortion in the blood flow. So the consensus would be that all submucosal fibroids would be removed, but all subserosal fibroids would be left untouched if no recurrent pregnancy losses are there. And all intramural fibroids, after studying the Doppler flows, we would take a call on those. When we talk of endometrial polyps and RPLs, the approach changes. Polyps adversely affect the endometrial receptivity, because usually polyps get their origin from the fact that the endometrial has this tendency to be polypoidal. So then its receptivity for the fetus and its implantation would also get hampered. So first trimester spontaneous abortion rate is 5%. If the polyp is more than 1 centimeter, or if multiple polyps are there, then we do always propose a polypectomy. Hysteroscopic polypectomy increases the pregnancy rate in women with no other reason to explain, irrespective of the size or number, with a low rate of complications. Iatrogenic, sometimes Asherman's we'll get, sometimes intrauterine adhesions because of previous hysteroscopies or DNCs which were done with not such careful aseptic measures. Infective causes, post-traumatic causes, decreased blood supply due to some reason, some tumors in the ovary or something leads to, all this would lead to poor implantation. So abortion rate would be as high as 40% in these cases, and preterm labor would be 23%. Management is easy actually. If you think hysteroscopy with intrauterine adhesiolysis gives us excellent results. So hysteroscopy's role in habitual abortion, as I've been stressing all along, structural uterine anomalies will be detected in half of the patients with habitual abortions, and after appropriate treatment when applicable, 78% with spontaneous abortions will achieve successful pregnancy. Hysteroscopy has so much to offer in the diagnosis and treatment of spontaneous uterine abortions. Now let's talk of cervical insufficiency. That's also an anatomical contributor. When will we label a patient as a case of incompetent cervix? Because more often than not, we diagnose people as incompetent cervix and then we offer them a cerclage. But there are certain absolute guidelines for deciding on those factors, and let's not overdo the encirclage stitch. Cervical insufficiency affects around 1% of pregnant patients only 1%, and is the cause for 20 to 25% of all second trimester losses. The etiology could be idiopathic, it could be congenital disorders, it could be DES exposure, rare now, connective tissue disorders, again rare, surgical traumas, conization, or traumatic damage to the structural integrity of the cervix, repeated forced cervical dilatations associated with dilatation and curettage. The etiopathogenesis, usually the cervical incompetence is an active and not a passive phenomena. It is a specific entity involving not just an abnormality or a defect of cervical collagen, but it is also due to either absence of the usual cervical musculature in cases of congenital incompetence, or some injury or damage to that musculature caused by previous trauma. So when we talk of the pathogenesis, the biochemical events implicated would be decrease in the total collagen content, increased solubility of the collagen, or something which is causing collagenolytic activity and destroying the collagen in the cervix. Usually the patient will give us a very, very proper history of a painless cervical dilatation with a preterm delivery. Or she'll give a history where the doctor did give her an intimation about a cervical dilatation, which was very difficult during the DNC procedures in the past. Or some obstetrical trauma in the previous delivery, some cervical tears, or a late second stage cesarean section because of prolonged labor. So prior cervical surgeries, cone loop, or DS exposure. We do a cervical sonography to determine the shortened cervical length, where we also look at how much funneling is existent and how much of the amniotic sac is bulging into the cavity, down the cervix. So when we monitor the cervical length, more than the clinical, the transvaginal sonography has a role here. The optimal technique we always propose is the transvaginal sonography. Transabdominal sonography correlates well with TVS only if done post-void to avoid the artificial lengthening, because we'll get a false length of the cervix, which wouldn't be true. So TVS is the absolute parameter. Ultrasound is significantly more reliable than digital examination because it could have observer-based variations. So cervical measurements, these are slides which are not so relevant for us. What we need to know here is that the cervical length of 25 mm is taken as an absolute hallmark, which anything lower than that would demand an encerclage. And if there's a protrusion of the membranes, funneling, which we talk about, or presence of fetal parts in the cervix, and we really want to take this pregnancy ahead, we'll have to intervene in these pregnancies. These are just the different kinds of funneling which we come across: T-shaped, Y-shaped, V-shaped, and U-shaped. So when we talk of the classification of cerclage, we may do it prophylactically, so for some people, electively prophylactically, because they've had recurrent pregnancy losses, we are not sure about the cervical cause, and we wouldn't want to leave any stone unturned, and we would prophylactically go ahead and do an encerclage. Then at some times there would be times when we would already have a shortened cervix and some bulging membranes or some funneling at the os, and we really want to do it as a therapeutic measure, as a salvage. Usually we do not call any encerclage as an emergency encerclage, but yes, at times it's a rescue measure. It's not an absolute emergency, but a relative emergency, where we would schedule the patient for maybe the next day and would want to do it the very next day or within 48 hours of discovering. And until then, put her on bed rest, absolutely. So neonomenclature's history indicates certain points, ultrasound tells us certain things, physical examination tells us certain things. So when we talk of the indications, history has to be compatible with incompetent cervix, and together with that we have to have either ultrasound changes or a clinical evidence of extensive trauma to the cervix. This is the criteria which ACOG follows, but then each patient has to be individualized. There would be times when the patient would not be falling in the criteria, but the gynaec may take a call that the person does need an encerclage stitch. So what are the green top guidelines? We take them as our gospel as gynacs when we talk of encerclage stitches, because like I said, it's overdone many a times. So when there's a dilemma, we really need to follow certain guidelines when we have to come to a decision which is evidence-based. So history of previous second trimester loss or preterm delivery, or an ultrasound showing cervical length of less than 25 mm, or a history of radical tracheolectomy, we have to offer the person cerclage. Then it could be the choice which judiciously has to be decided between the patient and the doctor. When do we propose an ultrasound monitoring? When the history of 2 second trimester losses or preterm deliveries is there, or uterine anomalies with or without hysteroscopic correction have been present and are known, or diagnosed during the course of the antenatal period, then we have to follow up the patient with an ultrasound monitoring. Or incidentally, we diagnose a short cervix with no previous losses. Then we don't need to jump onto the encerclage. We would rather follow the patient very closely with an ultrasound monitoring with bed rest facilities. And here, by bed rest, it wouldn't be an absolute bed rest. It would be like she's to be home, not pick up any weights which are more than 5 kgs, not bend forwards. She could go to her kitchen, do tidbits, and she could go to the washroom. When would you recommend it? Absolutely, we do not want to recommend it, but multiple pregnancies, we have to take the call on individualized basis, whether we want to do it or we do not want to do it. Because sometimes we may say that all multiple pregnancies do not need it. Most of them won't need it. That cannot be the hallmark for deciding that all multiple pregnancies need a cervical stitch. But at the same time, the clinical judgment and the transvaginal ultrasound successively done, if it's leading to shortening of the cervix, and if it's anything less than 25 mm or 25 mm also, we would rather propose a stitch to that person. If the patient has had a cervical biopsy, that doesn't mean that we put a stitch for her, or a previous cervical tear also in the previous pregnancy doesn't absolutely demand a cervical encerclage stitch. So what are the contraindications for a uterine encerclage? When we talk of contraindications, we have to assess clinically the pregnant lady, because we're doing the encerclage in a pregnant lady, and the responsibility is huge that you should not do any harm. Uterine contractions, absolutely you cannot offer her a encerclage, because you would enhance the release of prostaglandins there, and further on she'll abort for sure, and you'll even harm her cervix and make it difficult for future pregnancies also. Any element of uterine bleeding, even if it's spotting is there, we refrain from doing an encerclage. If any infection is there, chorioamnitis can set in. It's an absolute contraindication. Rupture of membranes has occurred, we absolutely do not do it. If severe maternal disease is there, it could be the body rejecting the pregnancy completely because of the maternal disease. We do not want to offer encerclage. Or if there's a fetal anomaly which is incompatible with life, we do not want to offer an encerclage. There are different cervical procedures. I don't think the talk today needs to go into these. Usually the ones which we do in Bombay are McDonnell and Shirotka's operation, and nowadays we do laparoscopic cervical encerclages also. So I'll just forward these slides which don't. Let's talk of rescue cerclage. So small randomized studies have been done, and at 22 to what they found was at 22 to 24 weeks gestation, symptomatically bulging membranes the patient came with, and cervix clinically would be less than 4 centimeter dilated, and there would be no contractions. This person would need a rescue cerclage. There's evidence of reduction in the neonatal morbidity. Even if we are able to take this pregnancy only by 4 weeks ahead, we would want to do this rescue cerclage. So this needs to be kept in mind and has to be offered to the patient. If we come across a 24 weeks gestation or a 22 weeks gestation, we know that the salvageability of the baby improves with every day that the baby spends in the mother's womb. So if we are able to offer a cerclage, keeping in mind the contraindications are not present, and then we can just give neuroprotection, magnesium sulfate to the baby and steroids for the lung maturity, and take her ahead by roughly a week also, or maybe more. Sometimes 10 days to 4 weeks also we are able to take ahead. That would be really making a huge difference to the survival of the baby. So meta-analysis was done, randomized controlled trials were done of over 600 women, and we found that in the population monitored, singleton pregnancy with prior preterm birth, cerclage was effective at all lengths below 25 mm. So kind of hallmark figure is 25 mm if found on transvaginal. That's a good take-home point, a good practice point, that below 25 mm we must go for an encerclage. When we talk of endocrine causes of recurrent pregnancy losses, PCOS, luteal phase defects, diabetes mellitus, and thyroid disorders are the major contributory factors. When we talk of PCOS and RPL, this is one of the most correctable causes of recurrent pregnancy loss. So pregnancy loss increases in patients with polycystic ovarians and ovarian syndromes, and certain lifestyle measures and a certain different approach individualized to these patients could give us a very successful pregnancy outcome. So instead of going for induction with Clomid, etc., we would rather go for a GnRHA induction for ovulation, and then miscarriage rate would hugely decrease. In recurrent spontaneous abortion patients, especially those who have increased LH and DHES, they'll be prone to recurrent losses. So in these patients especially, we would prefer that we take the cycle in our hands, and instead of going for a natural cycle, we would rather control the cycle with estrogen and progesterone supplementation and do an ovulation induction, not with Clomid but with other things, and then go ahead and get a successful outcome. Here metformin also has a huge role. In a retrospective study of PCOS women, which was done quite some time ago and proven and followed by everybody, group 1 had metformin during pregnancy and group 2 control were not given metformin. Early pregnancy loss rate was 12.9% versus 41.9% in these two. Significant p-value. Prior spontaneous abortion risk, like even those people who had prior spontaneous abortions, for them also metformin gave a success rate which was hugely different from those who are not on metformin, 15.7% versus 58.3%. So we have to keep the take-home point here would be that metformin has a huge role and should not be stopped when the patient is pregnant. Even with a tight glycemic control, we would want to keep the lady on metformin, because right now here it's not only about making her sugar levels normal and keeping the sugar levels in control. It's also about the fact that you're dealing with an endocrine disorder which has a much wider effect on many other factors, and this just introducing metformin would really help. PCOS and RPL association has always been thought to be doubtful, but studies have shown that metformin and GnRH induction with GnRH has changed the miscarriage rate. When we talk of luteal phase defects with insufficient progesterone, luteal phase defects are insufficient progesterone production, resulting in endometrial development, which is unsuitable for the embryo to implant and is associated with RPL, obviously. The existence of LPD is controversial usually because of the inconsistencies in its diagnosis and management. Progesterone supplementation is indicated only in pregnancies with ART, but this is not what is usually followed as a good practice point. We usually do supplement even people who have not conceived with artificial reproductive techniques. If we feel that because there's nothing to lose here, I'll talk about progesterone supplementation in detail, because it does change the scenario, not only for recurrent pregnancy losses, but otherwise also because of certain factors which we'll talk about. How do we define the luteal phase defect? Serum mid-luteal progesterone levels should be less, if they're less than 10 nanogram per ml. Mid-luteal progesterone levels do not always reflect the endometrial maturation. That is known and proven by most of the studies. So how do we come to a consensus? We talk of a lag of more than 2 days in the endometrial histology development compared to the expected day of the cycle. Earlier, we would just go for a mid-cycle endometrial biopsy and determination, or we would just do a blood collection and determine on a certain date, day 22nd, or a certain time in the cycle. Now we just do it on the day when we are doing the other tests, and then we match it to her cycle, and if it's lagging by 2 or more days, then we kind of label her as a luteal phase defect. Again, that's a very treatable cause, so we do need to identify it. When we talk of diabetes and recurrent pregnancy losses, high HbA1c more than 8% increases early pregnancy losses and congenital malformations too. So if we encounter recurrent pregnancy losses with diabetes mellitus, we would rather make her correct the HbA1c, like control her diabetes and then get her pregnant, because not only for a good outcome, but also for decreasing the chances of loss. If the diabetes is well controlled, then there's no increased risk of miscarriage as such. When we talk of RPL and thyroid, many conflicting reports are there, and we don't have any evidence regarding absolutely blaming the thyroid for it. But some conclusions say that an increased thyroid antibodies, even with a normal TSH level, could be contributing to recurrent pregnancy losses. So yes, one would want to do the entire thyroid profile for a patient with recurrent pregnancy loss, because we not only want to know the TSH, T3, T4 levels, but also free T3 and free T4 levels, but also we would want to know about the TPO antibodies, which could be related to RPL in euthyroid patients, but the mechanism is unclear here. So the take-home message from thyroid aspect would be, we need the complete thyroid profile, because not only the hormone levels in a euthyroid patient, but also the TPO antibodies, if they were much higher than the lab value normal. So when we talk of genetic factors now, anatomical we are done, endocrine we have done, and now genetic factors. So parental chromosomal rearrangements contribute in almost 2.5 to 5% of couples with recurrent pregnancy losses. One of the partners could be carrying a balanced reciprocal or Robertsonian translocation. Then there would be times when the embryonic chromosomal abnormalities are present, which is almost 30 to 57% of RPLs. So risk of miscarriage resulting from chromosomal abnormalities of the embryo increases with advancing age, and that is known to us. So we would want to know the parental karyotyping, and there are times when we want to do the embryonic chromosomal typing also. Fetal chromosomal abnormalities, parental balanced chromosomal rearrangement could be contributing to RPL, or single gene disorders like alpha thalassemia, thrombophilias, or X-linked dominant disorders could also be contributing. So risk karyotypic abnormalities, gestational age, if the patient's gestational age is more and higher in early gestation, we know that survival of the fittest rules everything. So many times early pregnancy losses, we always blame them on the genetics. 90% in anembryonic pregnancies and blighted ova, 50% of them are found at 8 to 11 weeks, 30% are found at 16 to 19 weeks. If we cross that period, then rarely 6 to 12% times we'll have genetic abnormalities. Advanced maternal age is a huge contributor, to the extent that in RPLs, miscarriage rate above 40 years of age would be almost more than 50%. So there comes a good practice point is, do we need a surrogate? That decision has to be made with the couple and the doctor sitting together as to, do we need a surrogate for some recurrent pregnancy loss which we've been dealing with along the line, and now she's almost turning 40. Do we need a surrogate? Do we need a donor over? After first miscarriage, we've already talked, the risk is almost 14 to 21%. After 2 miscarriages, it's 24 to 29%. After 3 miscarriages, it's almost 31 to 45%. Spontaneous miscarriages, when we talk of them, 10 to 15% of recognized pregnancies. Mostly sporadic, 80% losses would happen in the first 12 weeks. 50 to 70% of which will be due to chromosomal anomalies, trisomies, 13, 16, 18, 21. Monosomies, triploidies, and tetraploidies. So in these cases, we would want to do a parental karyotype to minimize the recurrence risk of abortions. POCs and recurrent miscarriages, fetal chromosomal abnormality in only some of can be diagnosed only in properly retrieved specimens. Now, these POCs, they may be due to abnormalities in the egg or sperm or both. When we talk of sperm aneuploidy, 13, 18, 21, X, Y, directly it would influence the rate of the aneuploidy in the conceptuous. The most common chromosomal defects we know are trisomy, monosomy, and polyploidy. So when we talk of genetic causes, parental chromosomal abnormality in an absolutely normal couple which we come across, there could be in one of the partners a balanced chromosomal rearrangement. In the general population, it is as high as 6 in 1,000. So when we are talking of RPLs, we need to think on the lines. They'll just be carriers. So translocation is one of the commonest, like I said. Mosaicism is rare, inversion is rare. So we don't go for a detailed chromosomal study, but we do want to do a basic karyotyping of the couple, as well as if possible, if she's come to us at a stage where she's just lost the pregnancy, we would want to karyotype the abortus also, the fetal or the placental tissue. Now, this is not always recommended because if the period when the loss has already occurred and the time when the patient's abortus is being sent has a huge gap, say it's 10 to 15 days ago the pregnancy loss occurred, and sometimes the couple just can't accept, and we as doctors just tell them to repeat the ultrasound and to repeat the beta hCG levels and then come to a conclusion and then take the call, then maybe it's too late to collect a abortus for a proper genetic cause. So you would rather do it immediately by convincing that patient by doing 2 consecutive beta hCG levels for 48 hours apart, because then immediately you can schedule her for a DNC and collect the specimen and send it for karyotyping. The couple's peripheral blood is obviously used for karyotyping in couples with recurrent losses. So this slide is just about whether we should karyotype the products of conception or we shouldn't. There's no definite recommendation for obtaining a karyotype of abortus. Karyotype analysis of abortus tissue for couples with a subsequent second or third pregnancy loss should be recommended. If abortus is aneuploid, maternal cause is excluded. If POC karyotype not possible, at least we'll do a parental karyotype for sure. Karyotype of the products of conception, if it's normal, fine. If it's abnormal, trisomy or chromosomal rearrangement, both will require parental karyotyping also. So that could be done as a first step also, because so many times we are waiting for the karyotyping results because they do take time. So if you have a case of recurrent pregnancy loss, one of the first tests which you would want to do is parental karyotyping. Direct parental karyotyping is obviously more cost effective also, and after first abortion we usually do not recommend it though. Why do we karyotype the parents? Individuals with balanced chromosomal rearrangements are usually phenotypically normal, as we already talked about it. They are at a risk of having conceptions which may have a normal genotype or a balanced phenotypically normal, balanced translocation which is phenotypically normal, or an unbalanced which will get spontaneously aborted, or a phenotypically malformed fetus may result. Single gene disorders, like again, one thing we usually do test for electrophoresis for beta thalassemia, but we do not usually probe into the alpha thalassemia effect in all pregnancies with RPLs. In all patients with RPLs, we need to check for alpha thalassemia also. Myotonic dystrophy, X-linked dominant disorders, not so common, but yes, found in multiple. When we talk of single gene disorders, hereditary thrombophilia is quite significant in numbers. When we talk of RPLs, they usually cause first and late first trimester losses. Microthrombosis occurs in placenta and impairs the uteroplacental circulation. So just a pointer here, we'll be talking about ecosprin and the role of heparin for hereditary thrombophilias later. The importance of doing a factor V laden gene mutation testing. Then we would want to test anti-prothrombin 2 antibodies, but at the same time protein C and S deficiencies have a role, but protein S would need to be done. And then we have to do certain combinations of these depending on what we come across. We need not do the whole thrombophilia profile if we are talking about evidence-based medicine where we are not making the patient spend the extra money. When we are genetically evaluating these cases, and there are certain recommendations for testing also, if there's a history of recurrent miscarriages, then we are suspecting thrombophilias. If there's a history of clotting disorders, we are suspecting thrombophilias. Stillbirth, neonatal deaths, yes, suspect. Babies with dysmorphic features, yes, we'll suspect. Infertility, yes. Mental retardation, developmental delays, and inherited disorders. All these have a huge linkage with thrombophilias. How do we diagnose? If the first miscarriage occurred less than 10 weeks, we'll ask the patient to try again. If the second miscarriage occurred less than 10 weeks, then we do a chromosomal testing for sure. If there's aneuploidy or polyploidy, we'll ask the patient to try again. But if we come across in the chromosomal testing, if we come across an unbalanced translocation, we would want to do a cytogenetics for both the partners. And if it's a euploid miscarriage, we would want to evaluate other causes. of recurrent pregnancy loss and get away from the genetic for them. So how do we manage? Now the topic which we've picked up today is antenatal care in bad obstetric history or recurrent pregnancy losses, as we want to call them, and IVF. So this something called pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, which has absolutely changed the scenario for recurrent pregnancy losses which have genetic linkages with them. So 30% and 70% we are talking about. IVF and pre-implantation genetic diagnosis would help in 30% of our cases. Outcome of pregnancies in which pre-implantation genetic diagnosis was done for chromosomal translocations. Now look at the two sides. Miscarriage rate was huge. And take-home baby was huge. Take-home baby rate was huge in those in which PGD was done. PGD is the embryos made by the IVF. I mean, if for somebody who's not aware of the term, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, what we do is we've already made the embryo in the IVF lab, and now we test it genetically for any anomalies, and then we go for implantation. So the take-home baby rate for these pregnancies is so much more higher. So that emotional trauma which is associated with recurrent pregnancy losses is obviously overcome. The difference is 17.8% versus 81.4%. But then going back to that, every candidate is not a candidate for pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. That has to be, the call has to be taken very judiciously by the IVF people, the treating gynac, and the general practitioners, because the patients would listen to them more. So that call has to be taken whether the risk of the PGD is more huge than the benefit which we would get. The benefit would be obviously taking home the baby. But at the same time, there's a huge risk involved at times when you're talking about pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, and that in itself is a big, huge topic as to from which zone we have to pick up the cells so as not to touch the, to simplify it, I would say, not to touch the fetal end and just to take it from the placental end. The cells which we are retrieving have to be taken more from the placental end, the mother's contributory factors, than the cells contributed from the mother's side, and rather than approaching towards the fetal side. When we talk of immunological factors, immunity and RPL again have a huge association. The causes could be autoimmune, they could be alloimmune too. Antiphospholipid syndrome, one of the most common causes for RPL, is the most important treatable cause of RPL, one would say. 3 or more consecutive miscarriages before 10 weeks of gestation, 1 or more morphologically normal fetal losses after 10th week of gestation, 1 or more preterm births before the 34th week of gestation owing to placental diseases, you must suspect antiphospholipid syndrome. Antiphospholipid antibodies are present in 15% of women with RPL, as against less than 2% in women with low risk obstetric history. In women with RPL associated with antiphospholipid antibodies, the live birth rate in pregnancies with no pharmacological intervention has been reported to be as low as 10%. So yes, one needs to intervene when we are talking of antiphospholipid syndrome. Primary antiphospholipid syndrome, PAPS, as we usually call it amongst the gynacs, refers to the association of adverse pregnancy outcome and presence of antiphospholipid antibodies. Secondary to autoimmune diseases such as SLE, polyarthritis nodosa, etc. Royal College says that antiphospholipid syndrome is the most important treatable cause of recurrent miscarriages. So antiphospholipid antibodies, there are 3 kinds: lupus anticoagulant, LAC we call it, anti-cardiolipin antibodies, ACLA, and anti-beta-2 glycoprotein antibodies. What is the criteria? How do we label somebody as APS? Antiphospholipid syndrome refers to the association between the antiphospholipid antibodies or some vascular thrombosis and an adverse pregnancy outcome. This is a strict criteria which we need to follow. So how do we diagnose a PAPS? based on clinical and lab criteria, obviously. One obstetric or thrombotic criteria and one lab criteria should be present to diagnose a PAPS. Other autoimmune diseases have to be ruled out to make the diagnosis of PAPS. How do we investigate these patients? The most important point, take home message for all of us as doctors and to remember is that we'll have to do the testing twice, and the testing has to be 12 weeks apart. We cannot label somebody as APLA without doing the test twice. False positive results are seen in PAPS. Improperly collected and processed samples, temporal and trimester wise fluctuations are seen. So immediately if somebody has aborted, you wouldn't want to offer them a testing for APLA, because you would want to wait 6 to 8 weeks and then do the testing and subsequently repeat it after 12 weeks, find out if she belongs there, and then treat that cause or label her as an APLA. VDRL positive patients who may or may not have syphilis may sometimes give false positive results. General infections and inflammations may sometimes give false positive results. Coagulopathies and anticoagulant medication, patient is on aspirin and heparin, may give a false positive result. Goals for treating PAPS are avoiding early pregnancy losses, normalizing the placental and fetal circulations to prevent early birth from obstetric complications such as preeclampsia and growth restriction, which are so common in PAPS patients. Preventing any maternal vascular thrombosis in pregnancy and postpartum period. So whatever we'll offer to these PAPS patient in terms of treatment will continue way into the postpartum period for about 6 weeks or so. How do you manage APS with RPL? Aspirin and low molecular weight heparin. Women with PAPS without a history of a thrombotic event versus women with PAPS with a history of a thrombotic event, past or present. Prophylactic therapies such as aspirin and heparin in pregnancy and 6 to 8 weeks postpartum. But full anticoagulation would be needed in a person who's had a history of a thrombotic event, because pregnancy, as we know, is a hypercoagulable state, and she also has PAPS. So we would need to offer a full anticoagulation with heparin and take her to the postpartum period with that full anticoagulation medication. Now, when we talk of aspirin alone versus aspirin plus heparin, here also we have a thin line. Again, the patient has to be individualized and the treating doctor has to take the call whether the need for heparin is there or not there. Recent meta-analysis shows that combination of aspirin and heparin is better than aspirin alone in achieving live births in women with recurrent pregnancy loss and antiphospholipid antibodies. Now, what would be the clinical tips for using heparin? Consider the cost, convenience, and compliance before initiating the therapy. The therapy should be started when fetal cardiac activity is demonstrated and continued throughout the pregnancy and postpartum. Heparin in prophylactic doses need to be stopped for about 24 hours around the time of labor and delivery. Heparin in prophylactic doses cannot be monitored, need not be monitored actually by coagulation parameters, but we would want to do a platelet count and a baseline platelet count, which we would have anyway done for the antenatal patient. And we'll do this weekly for the first 3 weeks, and when the patient is on heparin, and then we can subsequently follow it 3 weekly. Standard doses, if we are using unfractionated heparin, which again is rare nowadays but cost effective, 5,000 units subcutaneous BD. And if we are talking of enoxaparin, if the patient can afford it, then 40 milligrams subcutaneous daily. What is not to be done in a case of PAPS? We have to really withhold ourselves from giving steroids if we don't have any other indications for giving steroids, because steroid therapy should, as it's recommended, should be best avoided for PAPS because it significantly increases morbidity, hypertension to which she's already predisposed, diabetes to which she's already predisposed because of the vasculature being affected, and preterm births. Without any demonstrable benefit, one has to then again individualize the patient and take the call on steroid therapy. Immunoglobulins are still in the experimental stage, so wouldn't want to talk about it much here. So when we talk of thrombophilias and RPLs, they cause late pregnancy complications due to thrombosis of the uteroplacental circulation. Association would be obviously with late pregnancy losses, stronger, and it will have a stronger association with late pregnancy losses, obviously. Strong association is seen between second trimester miscarriage and inherited thrombophilias, factor 5 laden, factor 2 gene mutation, PGM, and protein S deficiency. These have a very strong association. So these three need to be tested for each and every patient. MTHFR mutation, protein C, and antithrombin 3 deficiencies do not give an evidence. We do not have an evidence that they are associated with fetal losses. And generally nowadays, if we would not want to propose doing these for all the patients. Inherited thrombophilic defects, when we are talking about these, they have been implicated as a cause of RPL and late pregnancy complications, causing thrombosis in the uteroplacental circulation. Association between thrombophilia and late pregnancy loss, we've talked this. Sorry. Now, why the immune reaction? Throughout human pregnancy, the genetically foreign semi-allogenic fetus and placenta evade the maternal immune response. The fetus itself is like, we often say that it's like a parasite, and the host is the pregnant patient. So fetal survival requires significant regulation of the maternal immune system, but not such as to compromise the maternal immune protection. The human mind treats a new idea the same way as the body treats a strange protein. It rejects it. And similarly, the mother tries to reject the fetus. The mother's immune system tries to reject the fetus. So we need to deal with the mother's immune system. Again, in such a way that we are not compromising her immunity as such. When we talk of alloimmunity and recurrent pregnancy loss, in some pregnancies, the mother recognizes these foreign paternal antigens and sets up an immune rejection reaction to them, which causes abortions. In habitual abortions, this reaction is repeated in every subsequent pregnancy and it worsens with subsequent pregnancies. So now I would want to talk about the endocrine immune interaction, where progesterone modulates the mother's 2B immune response. We see and we practice, all of us, that we do want to give progesterone to so many patients, even if those who have not undergone an artificial reproductive technique to get them pregnant. There are two kinds of cytokines acting in recurrent pregnancy losses. One is the Th1 type, T helper 1 cells, and the other is Th2 type. The good one here is the Th2 type. With the production of more of these, the anti-inflammatory of the cytokine of these cytokines, interleukins 4, 6, and 10, they are able to overcome the tumor necrosis factors and interleukins which are trying to reject the pregnancy. Normal pregnancy, all the normal pregnancies which we come across might be, like, this is proposed, this is not absolutely proven, but after whatever I could lay my hands on, I have come to the conclusion, and mostly all the books also say the same, that normal pregnancy might be the result of a predominantly T helper 2 cytokine response, whereas a woman with recurrent miscarriages has a bias towards mounting on a T helper 1 cytokine response, antibodies for the T helper 1. Immunological pathways of rejection could be antibody mediated, could be T helper 1 cell mediated, could be natural killer cells mediated. So antibody mediated embryo destruction happens, and the abortogenic shift happens because of the allogenic reactions. When we talk of progesterone induced blocking factor is what we are talking about when I say PIBF, progesterone induced blocking factor. And that is the key to embryo survival, because that would activate the T helper cells and block the NK activity and T helper 1 cells activity. The progesterone could be given as oral route, intramuscular, subcutaneous routes, gel forms, or vaginal. In the early phases of the IVF, when the patient has already conceived, we usually go for oral preparations as well as gel forms, along with intramuscular or subcutaneous injections. Then gradually we move ahead and we do not withdraw all the progesterone completely. Gradually we step it down and withdraw the gel forms, and then we continue with the intramuscular injections and the orals, and subsequently we prefer giving vaginal route and oral route only and get away from the injectable forms. Progesterones for preventing miscarriage. There seems to evidence of benefit, not absolutely proven by the studies, but treatment for these women may be warranted given the reduced rate of miscarriage in the treatment group and the finding of no statistically significant difference between treatment and control groups in rates of adverse effects suffered by either mother or baby in the available evidence. So basically here again, the good practice point would be to give the progesterones, because the risk benefit ratio when you measure the benefit of progesterone far outweighs any side effects due to the progesterone, which mainly are usually just bloating and a feeling of heaviness in the abdomen. When we are going for immune testing in recurrent pregnancy losses, with the exception of APL testing among women with recurrent miscarriages, there's little evidence to support any particular test or immunomodulatory treatment in the investigations and treatment of couples with reproductive failure. These tests and treatments should be restricted to those entered into formal research studies. When we are doing research, we would want to give everything, do everything, but RCOG guidelines do not recommend it for everybody. Immunotherapy, we are not talking about it because it doesn't have a very significant role. When we are talking of infective agents, bacterial vaginosis does contribute in recurrent pregnancy losses at times. Incidence is less if we take the overall incidence of RPL, but definitely this is a cause which needs to be treated. For an infective agent to be implicated in RPL, it must persist in the genital tract, and to avoid detection or must cause insufficient symptoms to disturb the women. Routine torch screening should not be advised, but then again, the usual scenario in our country is, because most of our pets, so many of us do not immunize our pets, so instead of blaming the pet, we would rather go for the torch titers. In this scenario, I would want to talk of one thing. When we are talking of torch titers, we go for IgM and IgG testing. If we get IgM positive, obviously we are going to treat the infection, but if we get an IgG positive only reading for any of the torch infections, then we go for subsequent IgG testing after a gap of say 3 weeks. And if it's a rising titer, we go for avidity testing. And if the avidity is high, that's good news for you as a doctor as well as the patient, because high avidity would mean that the patient had an infection in the past, so we are not bothered. Or even if the IgG values were not changing much and were roughly in the same range, avidity is the thing which would give us an insight into whether we want to treat it, give something for the torch infection, or just move ahead. This is not a very huge contributory factor to recurrent pregnancy losses, but over the years, this has become a less contributory cause. But considering what we saw in the clientele which we dealt with in the medical colleges, at least 15-20 years ago when I was a student, I would say that yes, we would want to probe it if we feel that there's a need for that. Torch and Listeria infections do not fulfill the criteria to be implicated in the etiology of RPL, and Indian studies wouldn't absolutely agree with this, and all the people practicing in India with different kinds of population may not agree completely with this. Torch screening is unhelpful as per the Western literature in investigations of recurrent miscarriage and should be abandoned. In a way, we can agree with this also, because there's one aspect to it. This infection wouldn't stay and continue staying, because at some point in time, 3 months down the line, the lady would become totally free of that infection. And then if we can get a high avidity report and an IgG titer which is high for that particular torch test, then we could just move ahead and plan the pregnancy without even remembering this. Bacterial vaginosis is implicated in first trimester of pregnancy as a contributor, and second trimester miscarriage and preterm delivery also happens. Screening and treatment of bacterial vaginosis in early pregnancy among women with a previous second trimester miscarriage or spontaneous preterm labor may reduce the risk of RPL and preterm births also. So yes, a high vaginal swab is recommended in all patients who are coming to our clinic with recurrent pregnancy losses. So these are some of the common infections which we are talking about. We even have to remember the semen culture has to be done for recurrent pregnancy losses, because sometimes it could be the semen which is contributing with the infection and causing repeat losses. Let's talk about the male factor in RPL. Positive association of sperm dysfunction is seen in RPL. Y chromosome microdeletions is one of the causes, but it is implicated, but is not so important in RPL. Men with higher DNA fragmentation index are infertile, whereas men with lower DNA fragmentation index are able to conceive but experience RPL. So yes, we want to study the semen in detail, not only with the semen analysis, but sometimes semen culture, as well as do the genetic testing for the, we've already done the karyotyping, we talked that's mandatory in most of the cases. Unexplained RPLs. Women with unexplained RPLs have an excellent prognosis for future pregnancy outcome. 75% times we'll get a successful outcome without pharmacological interventions if offered supportive care alone in the setting of a dedicated early pregnancy assessment unit. Because it's a recurrent cause, we need to know the reason. And if we come to know the reason, we can obviously treat it. But there'll be so many unexplained scenarios where we empirically treat in certain ways. And one of the take-home messages would be there that progesterone would have a role and aspirin and heparin would have a role empirically. Data suggests that empirically aspirin plus heparin in women with unexplained recurrent miscarriage is not found to be beneficial, hence unnecessary and should be resisted. But when we already have somebody with recurrent pregnancy losses, a good practice point which most of the doctors in India would follow, and I mean, I'm sure we all come across papers with Indian scenario studies where we would want to offer aspirin to every patient and progesterone to every patient and not sit on the pregnancy with just a more moral support. How do you approach RPL? You'll take the history, you'll do the clinical examination, you'll do the investigations, and subsequently the treatment. You'll do the genetic, I'm just going through the whole thing again. Genetically, we'll test karyotyping of the patient, karyotyping of the parents if required. If it's an IVF pregnancy already conceived, then we would want to offer a chorionic villus biopsy or maybe pre-implantation genetic testing or a chorionic biopsy. Then we would want to do these people's NT scan and double marker, which we do for everybody, offer an NIPT, and if NIPT shows some risk, then go for an amniocentesis, especially so in advanced maternal age. But I would say NIPT should be done for most of the people who have had recurrent pregnancy losses. Karyotyping of POCs is done for all patients. Parental karyotyping is required. We've already discussed that. For the abortus, one has to decide individual based. Investigations for APLA would include IgG, IgM for anticardiolipin antibodies, LAC testing, and beta-2 glycoprotein testing. All patients must be tested before the next pregnancy for this on 2 separate occasions, because during pregnancy we cannot test them. And 6 to 8 weeks apart, recommended is 12 weeks apart. When we are talking of imaging, a pelvic ultrasound, a 3D ultrasound with a reasonably good radiologist would contribute hugely. And hysteroscopy again has a huge role if any anatomic defect is found. Laparoscopy combined with hysteroscopy as a diagnostic measure to just see directly and find out a cause. And even HSG has a role, I would say. So when we are talking of investigations in RPL for infections, you would want to do the syphilis testing and a vaginal swab testing. Thrombophilias, you would want to plan it properly, do a factor 5 testing, factor 2 testing for antibodies, protein S deficiency as and when indicated. For immune, usually we do not do this. I said that this is not something which we do. It's more for theoretical purposes. And if we are doing some research, yes. For endocrine, you would want to do a thyroid testing, the fasting glucose, HbA1c levels. If above 8, you need to make her, get her to normal levels and then get her pregnant. If clinical manifestation of either disease is present or if the patient is known to have the disease, also test for thyroid peroxidase antibodies, not proven but found to be beneficial when checked. LPDs, there are no luteal phase defects, there are no standardized diagnostic methods for this, but we would want to do the endometrial biopsy as well as the progesterone levels in the patient and measure it in terms of the tables available for the progesterone at that stage where she is. And if there's a lag of more than 2 days, then definitely she needs to be supplemented. But again, as a good take home point and as a good practice point, I would suggest that progesterone should be supplemented in all of the recurrent pregnancy losses. Supportive care is obviously, that has a huge role. Progesterones, dydrogesterone has a huge role. Anticoagulants for autoimmune factors and thrombophilias, antibiotics for infections, immunosuppressants, immunomodulators for immunological disorders, and surgery for uterine malformations. Supportive care can help reduce the risk. Surgeries will obviously reduce the risk, can accompany with resection, like septum resection, myomectomy, cerclage, we've talked about these. They can all be beneficial in women with anatomical reasons for the recurrent losses. Anticoagulants, aspirin and heparin, as we've discussed, have a huge role, especially in cases of APS. We have to keep the platelet count in check every 3 weeks, or if required earlier, or in certain cases, we may need to monitor the patient for osteopenia, fractures, and maternal bleeding, and regulate the dose accordingly. Antibiotics like clindamycin have a huge role in bacterial vaginosis. At times, we give the clindamycin empirically and then do a high vaginal swab at a later date after the course of the antibiotic is over. Immune suppressant, immunomodulator agents have a role because paternal cell immunization, third party donor cell immunization, trophoblast membrane immunization, intravenous immunoglobulins. There's no evidence for this. Like I said, immunology contributing to this is still under research. HCG, now we come across so many people giving repeated HCG injections, but that has been proven. Like, we can do some treatments empirically, but HCG, mind you, is not one of those. As per evidence, it does not change the miscarriage rate. So that HCG injections have no role. Progesterone has a huge role because there is evidence for reduction in the risk of miscarriage, and we know why. Third-party reproduction in RPL indicated in patients with poor prognosis, repeat aneuploidies following PGD, PGS embryo donation, severe maternal hostile environment would demand surrogacy. Maternal X-linked disorders, go for oocyte donation. Severe sperm abnormality, we would go for sperm donations. Balanced parental chromosomal aberrations, we would go for artificial reproductive techniques, where again, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis which would have a huge role, and we would obviously choose and implant those embryos only which are healthy and good. Or we could even go for surrogacy in such cases if required. What are the challenges in RPL? Cause of individual abortion may be different. Each of these could be due to a different reason. More than one factor may exist. Thorough investigation often fails to reveal a cause for us. But we have to remember, it's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent that survives. It is the one that is most adaptable to change. So we have to give that environment where we make the patient adaptable to the changes of pregnancy. Women with recurrent first trimester and second trimester losses should be looked after by health professionals with the necessary skills and the necessary expertise. Where available, this might be within a RPL clinic. That's a good practice point. If APLA syndrome is there, all women with recurrent first trimester miscarriages and all women with one or more second trimester miscarriages should be screened before pregnancy, because pregnancy, even in different trimesters, may give different results for the antiphospholipid antibodies. Anticardiolipin antibody, IgM, IgG, beta-2 glycoprotein, IgM, IgG, lupus anticoagulant, these are the three which you would test for all the patients. And then repeat the test 12 weeks apart. Cytogenetic analysis should be performed on POCs of third and subsequent consecutive miscarriages. Parental peripheral blood karyotyping of both partners should be performed in couples with RPL, where the testing of POCs reports an unbalanced structural chromosomal abnormality. Even if we've not tested the RPOC, at least we should test the parental blood for karyotyping. Knowledge of the karyotype of the POCs allows us an informed prognosis for a future pregnancy outcome to be given. While in a city like Bombay, you would recommend it, where we have usually it's collected in a proper fashion, and we have Kotliwala lab and we have different genetic labs where you can send the POCs immediately. The collection is important, the refrigeration is important. The bottle needs to be called from the lab itself. Never, I would say that we should not attempt to collect it in our sterile bottles and then send them the specimen. We would rather call for the their collection bottles from the genetic lab itself, and then collect the specimen, refrigerate it, or rather send it in the ice pack immediately to the center. While a sporadic fetal chromosomal abnormality is the most common cause of any single miscarriage, the risk of miscarriage as a result of fetal aneuploidy decreases with an increasing number of pregnancy losses. If the karyotype of the miscarried pregnancy is abnormal, there's a better prognosis for the next pregnancy. So many times we'll send the karyotyping and we'll come across something like, say, Edward syndrome in the polycystic ovarian, in the POCs, in the POCs. And then you'll realize that you won't do anything for it. You will just share it with the patient, and you will be careful that in the next pregnancy, you will monitor her for any genetic defects. Now, when she is pregnant, when you take her ahead, you need not schedule her prior to pregnancy for an ART just because she had a syndrome, nor do a chorionic villus biopsy at 9 weeks. You would rather wait for the NT scan and double marker at 12 weeks. And if that is good, then you would do an NIPT for her for sure. And only if that shows a risk, you'll go for an amniocentesis. That's what we follow as a good practice guideline. So interventions have to be minimized, because again, the risk of any intervention, procedures which involve intervention with the embryo, can have grave consequences at times. When we are talking of anatomical factors, yes, definitely we need to intervene. All women with recurrent first trimester miscarriage and all women with one or more second trimester miscarriage should have a pelvic ultrasound, I would say 3D pelvic ultrasound, to assess the uterine anatomy. Suspected anomalies may require investigations to confirm the diagnosis, hysteroscopy even if it's diagnostic, and maybe combine an operative with it if required, laparoscopy, or the 3-dimensional pelvic ultrasound. They are in collaboration with each other. It's not either of these, it's all of those. Thrombophilias, women with second trimester miscarriage should be screened for inherited thrombophilias, including factor V laden, factor II prothrombin gene mutation, PGM, and protein S. ESHRE, which is the European, these are the European guidelines for human reproduction and embryology. We talk of the basic recommendations for testing the couple presenting with miscarriages. These can be found on, we've talked about most of them. If one wants to refer, one can go and type for ESHRE guidelines and read these to just recall whatever we've talked just now. Again, guidelines for management are there. We've talked about most of these. Thank you. I think, Asrani sir, we are open to questions if any.
Yes, ma'am. Very exhaustive talk, and our assisted reproduction techniques are still left out.
Actually, sir, I was trying to do this according to this one.
No, so we may call you after a month or so. There are
Definitely, sir.
Any particular size of intramural fibroid should be removed before the pregnancy if that is causing repeated pregnancy loss?
Yes, sir. So basically, when we talk of fibroids, the subserosal need not be touched. They are outside the wall. Submucosal definitely need to be removed. But when we are talking of the intramural, we usually leave them as such if the patient has not had any previous losses. But if the patient gives a history of a loss, and if there's no other cause which we can see for that loss, then we would rather see how much of that intramural fibroid is, how much of the distortion effect is there on the endometrial cavity. At the same time, we have to keep in mind that when implantation will happen, the implantation may be defective because of this intramural fibroids, or the vascularity may change because of this intramural fibroid. So if it's very near the uterines or the ovarian arteries, and if we see the placentation happening at, like when we go through the previous sonographies where she had a loss, and we see the placentation happening in those areas, then we would definitely offer the removal of that fibroid, the intramural fibroid. Otherwise, as such, if the patient has had no losses, we wouldn't want to remove an intramural fibroid. We usually remove only those which are distorting the cavities, the cavity of the endometrium.
In the present COVID era, what is the incidence of abortion or congenital malformation in COVID positive mothers?
So I wouldn't say that COVID has much changed the scenario of obstetric scenario, although I mean, in the whole of the 2020 we were just seeing people who were getting COVID, and then subsequently towards term they were COVID free and could be delivered fine and with absolutely the same outcomes as usual. But those who got pregnant later and had COVID in the earlier stages of pregnancy, which would mean second trimester, we are coming across few cases of IUGR. Now, the data is not enough to implicate COVID for the IUGR, but because of the fact that COVID is associated with thrombosis, we could come later on maybe with a conclusion that those who got COVID had either SGA, small for gestational age, or IUGR pregnancies. But this is just a thought, and what I am seeing at my center, and from what I've heard of the pregnant deliveries which are being done at Nair Hospital, because I think the maximum COVID pregnancies were maximum COVID deliveries were done at Nair Hospital. So they are kind of researching on this, that I don't think they'll have the resources now, considering COVID is back with a bang again, more lethal. But once we cross this bridge, then maybe we'll come across a conclusion when all studies can be statistically evaluated and a p-value arrived at.
Okay, Dr. Chitwan, a close relation in Surat, she
Yes.
detected COVID positive,
Yes, sir.
and that evening she did her UPT and it was positive.
Yes, sir.
And the gynecologist, they told her to continue the pregnancy.
Yes, sir. We would do that. That
We would do
COVID,
that?
COVID can never be the reason for asking somebody to abort, sir.
Okay, good. It is a very specific question. 36-year-old lady suffering from arteritis on immunosuppressant drug called Azaron. What is the chances of a successful pregnancy?
So please, can you, sir, repeat the question? Sorry.
A 36-year-old female
Yes, sir.
suffering from arteritis, an autoimmune disorder,
Mm-hmm.
on immunosuppressant drug Azaron.
Mm-hmm.
What are the chances of successful pregnancy with the drug going on?
So usually we, in conjunction, whenever the patient is on any immunosuppressant, then we get in conjunction with the treating doctor, the medicine people, and then we kind of modify the drug dosage as could be acceptable in pregnancy. And
Okay.
so many times those immunomodulating drugs are either completely stopped or changed to be compatible with pregnancy. And usually we go only for ecosprin and heparin and continue the pregnancy. And in these cases, especially, we introduce steroids, sir, and monitor the patient for any steroid related issues.
So now there are certain questions which I think are not part of this talk. So when we call you next time, we'll put you those questions and those topics.
Yes,
Thank
sir.
you very
Surely,
much for a wonderful presentation. Very exhaustive.
I
Thank
think I
you very
made it
much.
a bit too big. If I would have kept it smaller, maybe we would have discussed better,
No,
sir.
but you are kind of making us obstetrician, so that is good. Thank you very much, ma'am. Thank you very much.
Okay, sir. Thank you,
Yeah,
sir. Thank you
thank
so much. Thank you, sir. Bye.